Hello and welcome to Fair Play, the sport podcast from Pennington's Manchys Cooper, where we speak to sports stars and industry experts to discuss aspects of their sporting careers. I'm Virginia Henley. I'm in the charities team here at Pennington's Manchys Cooper, and I am joined today by my co-host, Sophie Bullimore, from our personal injury and medical negligence team, and a fellow member of our sports sector team.
Perfect. Thanks, Virginia. In this season of the podcast, we are focusing on the future of sport, looking into topics such as AI in sport, diversity and breaking barriers to make sport more accessible, injury prevention technology, and how people are consuming sport differently in today's world. We will explore with our guests how they and their experiences are shaping a new era in the world of sport.
Our guest today is Nathan Howarth. Nathan is the Executive Director of the Concussion Legacy Foundation UK, we're going to call it CLF, a charity focused on advancing the study, treatment and prevention of the effects of concussion and brain trauma. In his very limited spare time, Nathan also plays and is an active referee. Actually, Nathan, perhaps you don't play any longer,
anymore,
sadly.
no,
Only in the back garden.
Yeah.
Okay, but you're still an active referee for rugby. Okay, so we'll be speaking to you, Nathan, about your work in this area and whether enough is being done in sport to prevent head injuries. And hopefully we'll get a bit of your insight on how CLF is campaigning to make the future of sport safer. So thank you for coming to speak to us today, Nathan. Please, could you give us a bit of background about CLF, how you became involved with the charity, and perhaps a bit about your background too?
Sure, thank you. And thank you both for kind of hosting me. And I think, coming back to the kind of history of the CLF, we started in the US in 2007 with Dr. Chris Nowinski, who was just Chris Nowinski at the time, who was just retiring from WWE. So he was a former professional wrestler within WWE and former Harvard college American football captain. So kind of been exposed to lots of concussions in his own career and was going through his own journey with post-concussion syndrome. And so PCS is quite commonly associated with those that have had exposure to concussion that then have symptoms that persist or could be exposed to a kind of concussion and then kind of trauma around that by not being removed in the same time frame. And he worked with a leading expert at the time, who was a neurosurgeon called Dr. Robert Cantu. And together they kind of started at the early stages, the CLF, and started to look into the kind of issue of concussion and head injuries related into sport. And Dr. Cantu had been doing that work for several decades before that point. But they kind of were at the start of kind of Bennett and Marlowe and Professor Anne McKee looking at kind of CTE diagnosis in ex-NFL players. So around about the same...
Can we define for our listeners CTE?
Of course, so CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So it's a bit of a tongue tie.
Yeah, don't say it quickly.
That's why we shorten it to CTE, I think.
Absolutely. And so CTE is mostly associated with particularly sports, but anything that has repetitive head impacts. So we've seen it in ex-professional rugby players, football players, soccer players for the purposes of the US, but we'll call them football today. And then kind of we've seen it in ice hockey, military veterans, and even in people that have experienced intimate person violence. So kind of unfortunately where they've been exposed to domestic violence at home or alike. And of course the kind of more obvious populations in terms of boxing. And CTE is not necessarily new to the 2007 era. It was termed in the literature as dementia pugilistica, kind of from the 1920s and 30s, which was unfortunately and unhandedly called punch drunk syndrome, which is all to do with boxers and boxing. And when they passed away in the kind of early half of the century just past, they had identified there were particular disease patterns that were different to what we'd expect in other forms of dementia.
Yes.
So the CLF was kind of that was the birthplace, was just at that kind of the re-enlightenment and all kind of re-looking up of the kind of exposure that professional sportsmen and women and those exposed to repetitive head impacts have around CTE. So we came into the UK as an organisation in 2021, 22 through Dr. Chris Nowinski and Dr. Adam White. So, and that's how I started to get involved, was myself and Dr. Adam White worked at Oxford Brookes University together. Dr. Adam White is now head of brain health at the Professional Footballers Association. And as a result, I ended up taking on the executive directorship when he left. And kind of my own personal journey is I played rugby throughout all my life. I'm from Gloucester, so you don't get a choice to play rugby around there. And my family is heavily involved in rugby through one way or other, and had my kind of own battles with concussion and post-concussion syndrome, which thankfully, touch wood, I'm on the other side of. And actually, I then came into more of the research side. So I've been researching concussions now for kind of 5 to 6 years, and kind of taking that research further into concussion, post-concussion syndrome, brain health, and dementia. So, and currently now, as well as doing the role at the Concussion Legacy Foundation in the UK, also research fellow down at the University of Exeter and co-director of our concussion legacy project at the University of Oxford Brain Bank at the John Radcliffe Hospital. So, yeah, you're right to say there's a
very
little
limited
bit
spare time.
Absolutely. So yes, it does keep us entertained and busy.
Really, what did you study at university to even get into sort of researching concussion? Something unrelated?
Yeah, slightly unrelated. So I originally started at Durham University in a human geography degree, and then during COVID did a master's in sleep medicine. So kind of a slight leftward step. But I was always interested in this, and even in my final year at Durham, I was doing concussion research. Looking at how travel impacts concussions.
That sounds really interesting. Anyone that kind of follows rugby, and I appreciate that there may be listeners that don't, but the head injury assessment protocol is a very important tool in rugby that's been developed over the years and changed and reworked. But unfortunately, we still see frequent concerns about how it's being applied. And quite disparity sometimes in different matches or different sort of professional amateur scenarios. So if we compare Ellie Kildunn having to serve a mandatory 12-day stand down and therefore missing the quarterfinal match of the Women's World Cup last year to the incident in the recent Six Nations match where Gregor Brown was allowed to remain on the pitch without an HIA, despite appearing dazed after a high hit from Joe Hawkins, which resulted in a yellow card, we can see the discrepancy. In both examples, the new smart gum shield technology was important, with Brown's interestingly not automatically triggering an HIA. What is your view on the adequacy of the HIA protocol and how wearable tech, such as smart mouthguards and scrum caps, may impact the implementation of the HIA in the future?
Yeah, sure. And I think, these are really important examples because, I know for Ellie Kildunn, missing that quarterfinal and such a pivotal player for the England Roses was really crucial. But ultimately, the kind of long-term impacts and protecting brain health has to come first. And I think we're right to kind of identify that although the technology is there, a lot of it relies on the technology as well. Mm-hmm. And there are some unfortunate kind of gaps in the technology. We currently have it that the detection for the gum shields is based upon whether or not it detects the kind of movement. Now, although it's a good proxy, it is not what the brain is doing. No. So the mouth, although very close to the brain, it doesn't quite necessarily have the force that comes through. So we are aware of those studies that can show that it's that good proxy. But we also know that concussions can happen in a way that the forces translated to the head don't necessarily go through the mouth in the same way. Mm-hmm. Additionally, there have been examples where the smart technology, particularly in the Six Nations last year, kind of the alert came quite significantly later. So most of the technology is based on Bluetooth. Unfortunately, as we all know, if you walk with your AirPods or insert any other brand that you use for kind of wireless headphone devices, you walk away from your phone, you're going to disconnect. Yeah. So they have solved that problem in terms of they put an extender range on the match officials to help the Bluetooth kind of get back into range and to enable those alerts. I think the challenge is with these as well, that we can all see on TV these clear signs. The challenge is we're not a clinician with 60, 70,000 people in a stadium with your heart racing as well, because you probably run on the pitch a few times trying to identify these. So I think that there has to be, and that's where the smart technology, when works well, is really useful.
Yeah, as a tool to assist rather than
absolutely
being totally reliant in its own right.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that looks at particularly this example from the weekend in terms of Gregor Brown is that if we are assessing direct head contact, and World Rugby have a really good head contact framework that referees apply in terms of whether or not there is a foul play sanction for that head contact, shouldn't we be also including a HIA for that player? Because we're saying enough force has gone through for us to trigger a foul play protocol. That probably is something that needs to be looked at, and there are a few examples going back over the number of years, particularly with the head contact framework, HCP. We can look that actually a HCP has been initiated and probably a HIA should be at the same time, and particularly it's a useful period of time because we have that ability to kind of look at the video, and that's probably I think the HIA protocol in rugby is really good and is a really, compared to some sports, we've got temporary concussion subs that they don't exist in football. That we and other organisations have been campaigning for that for many years, and actually we don't have that yet. So the fact that rugby has this model is both really positive and something that other sports should be looking to take away. The fact that there's a head injury assessment protocol in synchronized swimming in Canada tells you that actually there should be looks at moving these head injury assessment protocols into different spaces. But actually, in terms of the HIA process for rugby, one of the particular improvements is that we currently do the video analysis whilst play is still alive. So if you take the NRL, so another variant of kind of rugby league, but kind of a professional league in Australasia, so New Zealand and Australia, they actually say that as part of their HIA time, which is longer, you have to do the video analysis when you suspect. And so again, the comments about clearly dazed, the problem is we currently don't know in terms of what that looks like for a player, and to be honest, should we know, it is confidential medical advice. If he ends up with a concussion, that will come out potentially in the woodwork whether or not he plays this weekend. But actually the things that are important are that actually it's a medical diagnosis, because we currently don't have a way of measuring that inflammation of the brain. And one of the challenges we also see is that although you might be cleared on the day and also kind of not even identified on the day, your symptoms might turn up kind of 48 hours later. That's why we have a 48-hour cutoff. And actually in the HIA protocol, you have a retest for anybody that was tested on the day, both 2 hours after the match and within a kind of a window of 48 hours post-match, to see if those symptoms turn up. Because it's like anything within the body, it's responding. It's not a simple flick of a switch and you get the damage. It's kind of accumulating in the background. So I think that's something to bear in mind, is it is quite a moving target almost to try and detect these symptoms, and that's why it is hard. And I have massive sympathy for medics in this environment that are trying to make a decision both in the pressurized environment but also trying to see from afar. And yes, we can see the videos at home, and maybe there is benefit in having spotters almost that are not involved directly in the day-to-day. We have independent match day doctors within rugby, but the problem is they're also running around in those environments. They're in the stadium. Do you remove them to a more remote location? Possibly that's where we might go in the future. And the other issue in terms of the smart mouthguards, going back to them, is we currently have decided through retrospective analysis, through research by particularly within the context of rugby, that the G-forces we're looking for is a certain point. That then, therefore, is where the cutoff is. So that doesn't mean that we don't have concussions underneath that level. And we don't have concussions that or hits that are more than that level that don't equal concussions. And so actually, potentially one of the things to be done in the future with research is to, particularly if you're triggering a HCP, is that would be a good blanket. Like, actually, if we do get direct hits to the head, we do a head injury assessments, and we can have a pretty good idea of whether or not that is causing concussions. And you mentioned scrum hats and scrum caps. The reality is a bit like where we are with the NFL, with foam adding to helmets. Like, that's increasing weight to the head, so that causes a whole another layer of problems around the injuries that occur. But actually, with rugby scrum hats, we probably don't see a lot of change in terms of the forces. Yeah. Some are tested around particularly linear acceleration, but goes without saying, there's a massive area that's not covered with the scrum hat. And a lot of concussions come from rotational forces. So some are able to do that or look at reducing those forces and might have some merit. The only downside is there is some evidence that I wear a piece of protective equipment, my behavior might change.
Yeah.
And so I might get more risk, I might take more risks rather than risk averse. Not saying that's necessarily going to increase concussions, but it potentially increases the opportunities for a concussion.
Yeah.
There's so many questions which are recurring to me while you're talking, and one of them is just about so you're obviously talking about how science and tech are both evolving, and it's coupled with this passion of so many people to keep playing rugby in spite of all the risks.
Yeah.
There must be such a huge amount of investment needed to keep pace with the changes and to try and protect people so that they're as safe as they can be if they want to carry on playing rugby. I mean,
absolutely. And I think that there's distinctions here between the kind of professional end and the amateur end. The amateur end, I think one of the most powerful tools around education in terms of particularly looking at kind of removing. So we've seen for a number of years now since Ben Robinson, who unfortunately passed away in Northern Ireland through second impact syndrome, the if in doubt, sit out, which has been a major campaign point, particularly for Scottish Rugby Union, and is now central to the UK government grassroots concussion guidelines.
Right.
So, we have that ability in terms of sitting out and educating around that message. And, most sports have a very similar campaign, and return to play protocols are pretty robust, and education programs such as Head Case, that they go to a degree, but are we also talking about some of the longer term elements and risks? I think that's up for debate currently. But the level of investment to kind of bridge for the amateur game and the professional game is still needed. So we can see the investment in the professional game in terms of the smart mouthguards, that's there. But we also then need to look at the investment of those that are already going through kind of difficulties post a playing career, and look at that kind of loading. So we've currently got a lot going into the kind of diagnosis of concussion on the pitch to prevent second impact syndrome, further complications for your concussion recovery. So the longer you play with a potential concussion and brain injury, the more damage you're doing. We also know that if you are playing on with a concussion, you're going to have a decreased performance. So you're not going to perform at your best. You're probably also at greater risk of another injury. So there is that need to remove. So absolutely, we're right to invest in that end, but we also have to invest in the kind of longer term, looking at the trajectories. So we mentioned CTE earlier, a paper jointly between the brain banks in Boston, Glasgow and Sydney and Auckland kind of highlighted the kind of current cases of CTE in rugby union, mostly coming from the kind of mixture of professional and amateur game. We kind of at the moment know that the more you are exposed to rugby, the more likely you are to get CTE. So we also need to invest in that end, not just the tech of diagnosing a concussion on the touchline. And I think that's where, changes in terms of tackle height are really useful in terms of reducing the likelihood of two heads in the same headspace. I think at the moment we've not necessarily seen the decrease in concussions from that tackle height change, but whether or not that's partly because of how that's enforced. Also, we've got better recognition now, and I think that's one of the key things is always identification at these levels is huge, because we're asking people that are not necessarily medically trained to also be trying to look out for each other. We're also, trying to get people to recognise what a concussion feels like for themselves. Now, if you've not had a concussion, you never know what it feels like until it's happened, and then you kind of don't really know what to do. And actually, that's, for us as a CLF, we put it on the teammates. You are the guys that recognise how people should be playing week to week, and they're your friends ultimately, and your teammates should help you out. There are particular opportunities in the community end with smart mouthguards, so people like Hit IQ from an Australian brand that are particularly around looking at your exposure during a game, but they can't remove you currently from a game. So one of the challenges, you need a lot of tech to be monitoring everybody's Bluetooth devices at the same time, but they can flag you at the end of the game, which is probably one of the points around, we're saying the professional game in the HIA is still having people that have a concussion that play on, both through the smart mouthguard technology not necessarily being completely bulletproof to concussions, but also the reality that symptoms take a number of days to appear. The reality for community rugby clubs is that they're not going to check in with those players on a Sunday night, Monday morning from a Saturday game like the professional end do. That's why they have physios, medics that are able to do that. And we say medics in terms of doctors in this scenario. And actually, so a device that can potentially flag this person has received a lot of kind of force during the game might need to be checked. The problem is who is also checking them. The reality for most people is that they're playing this sport and need to access help through the NHS. Now, the community concussion guidelines through the grassroots concussion guidelines that the government produced a couple of years ago says about NHS 111 being that service. Unfortunately, it relies on education of those medical professionals. We're the University of Oxford, one of the few medical schools that actually look at concussion in the curriculum. Yet, something like 1 million head injuries will turn up at an A&E every year. And unfortunately, I'm aware of stories from, wake them up every hour for the night of sleep. And it's like, well, sleep is one of the most important recovery tools for concussion.
That is really interesting because that is the received wisdom, isn't it? Historically.
Yeah, but that's because you're traditionally worried about a bleed on the brain, but you go, that's probably not the case. But if you're worried about a bleed on the brain, go give them a head scan. Don't wake them up every hour. Don't discharge them from hospital as well. Noted. So, and that unfortunately is the baseline. And, you also go try and get a GP appointment on a Monday morning to go and say, I've been exposed to a lot of head injuries.
But I would say from my perspective, the idea that maybe you can be flagged at the end of the game and say you have sustained significant impact or something, just monitor this, keep an eye on it. If you then have any symptoms which then cause you to call 111 or to get a GP appointment, with that information, you're much more likely to get a GP appointment quicker and potentially be taken more seriously. So,
absolutely, and I think that's the ideal world. I think we unfortunately know the reality for the NHS is that the demand is overstretched, and particularly the experience for GPs is this something within their wheelhouse? The reality is that although serious for long-term brain kind of impacts and brain health, this isn't something that is in necessarily the same kind of category of urgency for them, even though I would argue it should be. And I think it's something that we were are actively trying to get on both medical curriculum for kind of, as you say, undergraduates with our partnership with the University of Oxford, but also through higher levels of training. So whether or not that's GP training or emergency medicine training.
So there's obviously a lot of work to be done around educating us all about how to approach this. And I understand there appears to be a positive shift in how concussion is treated, both by clubs and players, but importantly in the media. And for example, the press around Gary Ringrose's withdrawal from a game in the Lions tour due to concussion was very positive. And I know this is something that's important to CLF. I think you've got a media project, which is the first and only concussion education programme for journalists, which sounds, in light of what you've just been talking about, hugely important at this point.
Yeah, and I think so. The birthplace of the media project was in the US around kind of commentators, particularly in American football and kind of ice hockey, really finding, you've seen something, but you don't know how to discuss it. And so research has subsequently proven that this is a really good opportunity to have that kind of public health message and tool around recognition. the reality is, like, how many of us have done an e-learning online and just gone click, 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 and go to the end
Never.
and go to the quiz at the end and go, right, this is the answers. That doesn't mean anything to us, and it doesn't mean anything to the mass public. What they do care about is, the kind of Sunday night soccer, that Sunday night football,
Yes.
wherever we are in whenever we're looking at professional sport, it's a shop window both into the game.
Yeah.
So, you'll see a trick that Ellie Gildunn's done, or Manny Feweboso is doing on a kind of England game, and we'll get that replicated in the community game of rugby. But actually, this is also the opportunity where we can discuss the kind of how to approach concussions. And so we just give a few talking points for journalists in terms of how they can approach those, both dead time, because it is, and they need to kind of address what has happened, and also the opportunity to kind of discuss current guidelines. We kind of particularly try and distinguish that professional end to amateur end, because we don't want people to think there's a HIA when you're playing any rugby outside of or any sport outside of a professional end, when you've got a doctor and clear policies and processes in place. But also there's that opportunity to kind of also look at the recognition of when a concussion has happened, to remove and what actually needs to happen post that removal in terms of return to play. And so we were really successful in the UK bringing that into particularly football. So we partnered with the Professional Footballers Association, or the PFA, the Jeff Astle Foundation, as well as the FA and EFL, so the English football leagues, to bring that as a package a couple of years ago. And we educated over 60 football journalists and commentators on some things to kind of think about and use in those times where a potential concussion has occurred. Obviously, football is very different to rugby, but obviously it gives a good opportunity to kind of really highlight those areas around also changing the narrative around concussion.
I think it's so important because I also think probably the work you're doing there is so empowering, because I know in Sam Peters' book Concussed, where he talks about just like this whole feeling that you kind of know something's not right, but it's not appropriate to talk about it, or you don't know how to talk about it, and how that develops over time as well. So I think giving them the tools that they would feel more comfortable talking about it and raise awareness in that side as well is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sam started to discuss these issues about the same time that the CLF was being set up in the 2007 World Cup, and I think that's really important that we give everybody an opportunity to kind of voice their concerns, and we have seen monumental shifts in terms of attitudes around concussions and head injuries, but they're going to have to continue to change. We still see people trying to kind of be tough, kind of go through those impacts. How many people kind of get up from a tackle and go, wow, right, not feeling great. How many of those go on to be subsequently tested for concussion and making sure they've not got it?
Yeah.
I think that's the problem, is we always look for the overwhelming evidence that you've got a concussion. Everybody can think of somebody that's unfortunately lying unconscious, but that's only 10% of concussions, and that's in the scenario that we screen everybody that's had a kind of incident where you are shocked by the head impact you've received, and we currently don't do that. So we probably are underestimating how many concussions do occur that people play on with. And as you say, without having that true sense of exposure and the impacts that you have, we don't really know how many are actually going on.
Yeah, and I think probably from the other end as well, even how different people come out in the media later on when they are then diagnosed with these sorts of conditions. And you get some people that say, if I'd have known that back then, I would have never played. And then you are getting other players that say, it doesn't matter, I love the game, I was going to do it regardless of what ended up happening, and how that's ultimately portrayed as well is important.
Yeah, and I think one of the things there is, we still have a duty to kind of look at the kind of where the science is now and present that data to players now,
so
that they understand
about their choices.
Exactly. So have that informed choice around participation, but also with the knowledge that this is an evolving science. Actually that should be the consideration around when we kind of talk about where and when head injuries occur, and we have to also get into the sports that are less likely to be considered in kind of the general narrative of having concussions. You know, I mentioned that synchronized swimming has a head injury assessment
which
earlier.
Completely shocked me. I had no idea.
But then, if you're part of synchronized swimming, you hit someone in the head. It seems logical to you that you have that involved, and so yes, it is slightly unexpected that swimming has and synchronized swimming specifically, and to a degree, any form of swimming, you can hit your head. How many times have you done backstroke and miscounted your strokes? I have a few times. So, you
stick
will...
to breaststroke.
Absolutely. And you could be exposed that way. You know, for females in the US, you're most at risk of getting a concussion from cheerleading and being dropped. So when you put it like that, it makes sense. But again, when we think
most at risk because there's a higher population of females playing, performing cheerleading, or is that?
Well, again, without looking at the numbers, it could be that it's the higher number performing, but in terms of potassium, and in terms of population, absolutely. But again, I think it's because we only think about those kind of sports that we've mentioned here, football and rugby, and you think of the American sports, ice hockey and American football, they particularly stand out as sports that kind of feel as though they're going to have particular concussions risk and head impact risk, but that they happen all over the place, and cycling, again, we do think about it because of the kind of severe end of the crashes, but how many other crashes do occur? Diving,
diving. The speed with which divers hit the water.
And again, if they get it wrong, it's and Tom Daly talks about it.
Yes,
it's like a car crash.
Oh gosh.
And we know, unfortunately, through the measures of kind of G-forces, that some of the G-forces that people are exposed to are equivalent to a car crash. If not, there was a study by FIFPro, so they're the organisation that represent the player associations for football, or association football across the world, and they showed an 80 G-force header. Michael Schumacher crashing an F1 car is 80 G-force. Okay, it's not the whole body experiencing the G-force, but the brain is experiencing 80 Gs.
Yeah,
that's huge.
Can I just ask about research? Because it sounds like lots of research is necessary. You have an encyclopedic knowledge on this subject. It's clear. But in terms of CLF and the projects that CLF is focusing on, is there anything specific which you're really kind of looking at the moment?
Yeah, of course. And so we also across the kind of, we've got 4 of our kind of partner organizations. The US, where we're now changed our name to Concussion and CTE Foundation to recognize that a lot more of our work is balanced on the kind of CTE side of and longer term impacts. And we've got colleagues in Australia and Canada that we also work really closely with, and probably in reality that, we as an organization will change our name to mirror the US as well, because we also are focusing on that CTE end, and to that end, in terms of the CTE and the kind of longer term brain health impacts. We actually are collaborating with the University of Oxford and their brain bank and research brain bank at the John Radcliffe Hospital to undertake those activities to both diagnose CTE and investigate potential diagnostics in life. So at the moment, you can only be diagnosed post-mortem, so after someone's passed away. But we are hoping that with that evidence research and across the kind of contribution to the global brain bank network, where I think that we're up to 9 or 10 different brain banks across the world that contribute into both the Concussion and CTE Foundation and Concussion Legacy Foundation kind of work, we're able to kind of have a good understanding of how CTE might develop into Alzheimer's disease, motor neuron disease, Parkinson's disease, and things like that. So those are kind of an end of the research that we're doing. We also do, as you've mentioned, in terms of research around media commentary on concussions. We actively support programs and investigations around kind of recovery from concussions and supporting those that are exposed to post-concussion syndrome. And in research, we also go a step further in the UK that we're part of two dementia networks. So through the University of Exeter, we're part of SPIN-D, which is a co-production network around research into kind of, and I say rarer forms of neurodegeneration, knowing that probably it's not as rare as we think to have CTE, particularly for those exposed to head impact exposures and repetitive head impact exposures. And then we're also part of a policy research unit at the University of Exeter. So we do a lot. You
sound incredibly busy.
Yeah,
how big?
Absolutely.
It's not a one-man band, is it?
No, we've got a good team of volunteers here in the UK, and we've also got a good network across the globe of researchers.
Yeah, so
I was going to
you
ask on that sort of how much collaboration is going. Is there some element of sort of like possessive research? We want to be the people groundbreaking this, not necessarily yourselves, but in the market. Is that happening, or is there a lot of information sharing about what's going on?
Absolutely. I guess the thing that currently exists is that there are still people that deny that CTE exists. I've had a couple of neurologists in the UK that tell me it doesn't exist, full stop. They don't believe in it. And I'm going, wow, right, okay.
So what do they think is going on?
Well, you'd have to ask them, I'm afraid.
Okay.
We know that there is some sports still don't necessarily recognise this in the same way that others do. And I think we are trying to move that narrative that actually we need to invest in, the kind of treatments around this and dealing with symptoms. So we know that, managing the symptoms associated with longer term exposure to brain impacts is really important and can lead to really good outcomes. So I think we have to focus in on that area. And so from our point of view, we do collaborate really well, and there is a desire to not go in towards that kind of possessive research, because the reality, the more people doing research, the more people collaborating and working on this area, the more that we're benefiting the people that are living with these kind of complications and impacts. So I think that's really important that we remember who we're here for, rather than it's for the research. And I think we try and do that across our collaborative networks and anybody we work with.
I mean, that definitely comes across, I think, from the CLF. It's just like whether or not that's kind of a wider sort of same appreciation from everyone, because I know, as you say, CTE obviously can't be diagnosed in living people. And if anyone hasn't watched Chris Nowinski's TED Talk, I would highly recommend it. But when he talks about literally reading the obituaries every single day and, trying to call people up and get people to donate their brains, you're talking about a very limited resource to do this research on. So obviously the more people that can share that, and the awareness and things makes a difference.
Absolutely. And we know that they recently produced research in Brazil that suggests that kind of from a community population that doesn't necessarily have the exposure, that the prevalence was about 0.6% of CTE. So, it is unique to those exposed into repetitive head impacts. And actually that was a population that we don't necessarily know their exposure. So probably they were exposed in reality. So trying to think about, often within kind of the CTE space, it's kind of thinking about individual deterministic or determinants of health. So alcohol, drugs, risky behavior, but actually that probably isn't replicated in terms of those that are affected. And, we've also seen within Scottish footballers that there was a kind of good paper last year, or maybe the year before, that was talking about actually the other forms of behaviors that we know that could impact your brain health are actually reduced in that population. So yet they still have an overrepresentation of neurodegenerative disease. So, and I think actually that there is that kind of need to, as you say, look, unfortunately, for more kind of evidence base around brain donations around CTE, and that's what we're here for. But we much prefer to help people in life as well, and I think that's important to recognise that we this is absolutely something that can be supported if people are struggling. So and because we don't want to read people's obituaries, we want to be dealing with people.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, Chris himself, has both in terms of a WWE playing career and his NFL playing career has put friends through the brain bank. So we don't want that at all. But actually, as you say, the kind of research towards this end is the most powerful goal when we do have to kind of research that element of CTE.
And there's so much chicken and egg in terms of what you know about it at the moment. Like, going back to the point you said a minute ago about like risky behaviours, where are those risky behaviours potentially leading to more cases of it, or where are those risky behaviours actually arising because of the disease itself? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's where support is really useful, because we know how to deal with those behaviours, but we also see that that we can see those kind of connections. So it will be interesting to see how we move that forward in the coming years.
Do you have any success stories that you can share with us, or policy changes driven by CLF's advocacy, training and research?
Absolutely. So, across the globe, there have been significant advances, but here in the UK, the Professional Footballers Association, even just a couple of weeks ago, was announced that they have a CTE prevention protocol. We've been working with them around looking at how they kind of look to reduce head impacts. So that's about head impacts starting later in life. And I'll come back to the kind of our campaigning around headers and the heading guidelines that come through from the FA. Less often, so we know that in the professional end that there's now this guidance of 10 high force headers a week, and then also a stand down of heading kind of either side of a match day. We kind of less often, less force, and also we're looking at like less frequency as well. So there's all those kind of elements of a CTE prevention protocol. As I said, we've also had some success in terms of the FA heading guidelines kind of going up to under 12s, so kind of removing the heading in for those age groups below. The reality is that mirrors things that are going on in other sports, such as no body checking in ice hockey until under 14. As you can see, there's a slight discrepancy in age there, so we might see that age creep up. We know that particularly young brains are particularly vulnerable to damage and potentially other consequences as a result of being exposed to repetitive head impacts so early. So we've had some really good changes there. And in terms of research, I guess recently some papers have been produced by the Boston Brain Bank around that CTE on its own can cause dementia without any other pathology. So I think that's kind of really interesting research that the causal relationship potentially is there around CTE, when we already know that research done by Chris Nowinski and colleagues around causation from head impact exposure is there as well. So those have been some really successful stories over the last couple of years, and there's many more that go alongside that we've been able to change across the world, but those are particularly pertinent. Particularly the kind of PFA CTE prevention protocol, I think, is really powerful, because it's a recognition of we need to try and remove head impacts in general, because I'm yet to have somebody that tells me that hitting your head is beneficial for you. Might be beneficial for your career, but I don't think it's beneficial for you long term. I'm yet to have anybody that tells me that.
Yeah, that sounds like really, really positive research you're doing. Are you noticing any sort of like particular difficulties in the research you're doing, or for example any sort of like gender gap that you're seeing in concussion research? Obviously there is a physical element involved in concussion, and I can understand the natural steer towards male sports where they are more physical, stronger people, and therefore the nature of the head impact is normally going to be higher. But are you aware of sort of a lack of data or funding for female specific studies, or any advocacy groups that might be pushing for more inclusive research?
Absolutely, and we ourselves are pushing for more inclusive research. We're probably behind the curve, particularly because of the differentials of where sport has previously been in terms of a more recent turn to professionalism. But also the reality is that medical research full stop is it didn't include women quite frequently. You know.
So just thinking on that point about brain banks. So I suppose two questions. One is, do you tend to have an equal split of male and females? No, so predominantly male brains.
And there are particularly, particularly in the Australia, we have female cases of CTE from sports women. We see it in Boston, and there's, as I say, there's a few on intimate person violence, and a few cases in the US. The US, their kind of NFL, NHL is played less frequently by women, if at all. So that kind of does make a difference. Yeah. We'll probably see in terms of football or soccer, we'll see much more of a trend towards that inclusion of women into our brain banks I'd like to think beyond my lifetime, but be more because I don't want to see them passing away early. But that's unfortunately a reality. As we're talking about people passing away, that we will see them come up because we are seeing those cases in terms of particularly in Australia, and they do have exposure to Australian rules football, so out there as well. So are
there any are there any points which you can already say though in terms of any distinction between the way that male and female brains react to repetitive
I think the thing to look here, and as mentioned, is the physical differences. We know that women have a different cervical spine structure to men, and have a different way that their neck strength is. So that seemingly puts them at an increased risk of concussion. There is some element of the menstrual cycle as well that seems to be impacting. Until recently, we more because it kind of looked at HRT, but we sort of thought that estrogen was very neuroprotective. It doesn't seem that adding estrogen increases the protection, particularly when we talk about dementia later in life. So HRT, through a meta-analysis, actually came out in December, January time, doesn't show that effect. But again, the reality is we haven't done a lot of research into HRT. Let's not go into the fact that there's more research on erectile dysfunction than there is on the menstrual cycle and menopause, but that's because
that's a whole other podcast.
Absolutely it is, and I recognise my positionality as well here, but that's some of the things that we have to kind of combat. And again, you're right that from a funding point of view, there is less money available from funders and also from sports at the moment for this area. We are seeing particularly rugby and football taking this kind of forward really seriously in terms of their funding arrangements, and we've seen that particularly in the kind of FA looking at ACL injuries. So they're putting a lot of money now into it. But again, come back to until recently there weren't boots that were specifically designed for women. There wasn't that recognition that women are not just a small male body. It is very different anatomically, and I think that's the challenge.
Trinket.
Exactly, and I think that's something that we'll see come forward. So absolutely, we need to see more in those spaces around head impact exposure for women and concussions in terms of research and prevention, because it will be different. And the models we have, particularly that have been developed from American football in terms of head impact exposure and what that leads to in terms of dementia and CTE risk, might be very different for women and probably will be. But we just aren't there yet in saying those things. So
and for race as well, like are you getting sort of different?
I'm not aware of any differences not that I'm particularly on the ground of some of the stuff from Boston around race, because I think one of the things here is partly that we're having to battle to just get it considered and thought about, that there might end up being around risk factors because of the demographics that are playing American football. And again, you're right to point out that medical kind of literature, particularly in the body and brain itself, is all being presented as it's a white man.
Well, that's the thing. You're kind of battling against so many different things, and it's not a criticism. These are things that I guess all need to be considered, but you only have to look at medical models to know what it's based off, and then you're already starting with that standard, which may not be appropriate. And how many things can you look into and research at the same time? There is a question there, but it's just always interesting to kind of know what you're feeling on the ground level doing this research.
And I think one of the the challenge at the moment for us is recognition for concussion, recognition for CTE and those that are exposed to it, and getting that in the agenda. So, although we've seen some really good work in terms of brain banking by Professor Willie Stewart up in Glasgow, particularly looking at ex-professional footballers, that's really positive. We need that to happen more often. We need to have more people inquisitive about rates of dementia in footballers to look for CTE. We need to have more people that are considering the kind of effects of longer term brain health exposure from sport. So that in itself is the first challenge, and then getting into those. Is there a female male difference? Absolutely. Is there any racial differences? Absolutely. We should be getting into those, and we should also be getting into the socio-economic consequences around these things as well, because it will not be equal, because health through determinants for health are not equally distributed, unfortunately.
And it would be interesting to see how that kind of differentiates between, for example, the UK and the US, given the completely different models of healthcare.
Yeah. Completely
fascinating. Honestly, that's been so interesting, Nathan. Thank you very, very much for your time and your insight. It's been great to speak with you and hear about the work that CLF is doing. Thank you.
I guess just to wrap up then, Nathan, what would you like to see change in the next 5 years when it comes to head injury prevention in sport?
Yeah, I guess, and even in the time that I've been involved in the CLF, and conveniently 5 years' time, a lot has changed. I think we need to see more around recognition, and particularly onus taken off an injured player. So recognise their vulnerability, and move that off them to kind of gain that support. Kind of more sports taking the PFA approach, which is looking at prevention of CTE and reducing head impacts, and ultimately looking at older ages for exposure, because I think that will be particularly protective. The perfect example of Tom Brady winning however many Super Bowls he did, I think it's 7 off the top of my head, don't quote me on that, and he never played American football until he got to college. So you don't need to be exposed to these sports to be a professional athlete. And I think that's really important to look at. So sports considering those head impacts, and ultimately support for those that are concerned around their kind of exposure, particularly, and that investment. And I think also, particularly those that are concerned, that they're really vulnerable people, that we should really consider how we look after them and make sure that they're not exploited, make sure that they are appropriately managed, because we have a duty of care for them, a duty of care for those that are currently playing but also have played. And I think we should really focus in on how we support, learn more, and research more around these elements, but also make sure it's not put onto them when they're struggling.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nathan. Honestly, I really admire the work that the Concussion Legacy Foundation is doing, and I look forward to seeing what you're going to achieve in the future.
Perfect. Thank you so much.